Whoever drinks beer, he is quick to sleep. Whoever sleeps long does not sin. Whoever does not sin enters heaven. Thus, let us drink beer.
Welcome back to the Go to Hell podcast. Strong opinions, weekly held, about Christianity, the church, and beer. I'm your host, Tim Curley, and I'm joined by my co-host, Colton Pierce. Colton, how is spring break going?
It's going good. My daughter's teething right now, so it's not super great. She's a pretty happy baby for a little bit, and then she gets really upset for no reason at all. Well, I mean, it's for a reason. I mean, her mouth hurts, but
out of nowhere.
It's just like, and you can't really do much to calm her down to when that's happening. So she's not explosively like upset or anything, but she's just like, you can tell she's not doing great when she focuses on the fact that she's hurting or whatever. So but other than that, it's pretty good. I'm getting lots of rest, getting all that in, because once this is like the only break for the next until Thanksgiving break where I'll get like time to sleep in and stuff and just kind of relax and kind of go through my mornings how I want to go through with them, because once water polo season starts in the summer, which we start the day we come back from summer break, is I'm working still like throughout that whole process, and I have to be at the pool by 8 a.m. and I live 45 minutes away from the pool, so like I got to be out of the house by 7, kind of stuff. So it's kind of nice to just kind of go through the motions in the morning, just kind of make her bottle, make my protein shake, just kind of enjoy the mornings, because don't often get that. So it's been great. How about you? How are you doing?
Not bad. Pretty good. It's March Madness week, so a lot of college basketball, men's and women's. The women's tournament has picked up quite a bit in popularity. I don't know if it's because of Caitlin Clark, the player for Iowa, arguably the best player ever, which kind of seems crazy it wasn't that long ago. We had Taurasi and some other players, but Clark's pretty amazing. Last year's ratings for the women's tournament were pretty high on television, so good for the ladies. So we're gearing up for all that, and then baseball starts a week from Thursday is opening day for some teams, and we got UFL, which is the merger of USFL and XFL, so stuff's going on, so it's pretty good. Other than that, things are pretty good. I might have mentioned the last time we recorded that I had a bad week and made it to church on Sunday. And so, as two people who don't go to church that often, or certainly not as much as we used to, and spend a lot of time talking about home church and church Inc. and all that, I gotta say it was emotionally needed. There was a moment in church, and it wasn't because somebody said anything. I just felt like I got very overwhelmed and moved a little bit to tears, to just feeling like, yeah, I needed to be here. So
you fucking Presby.
So for all those who still get something out of church, I think there is something just to be there and with people. So
fucking Pentecost.
So
oh my gosh.
Okay, we'll do one quick I have a lot of what the X, but we'll punt them down the road because none of them are time sensitive. But I have one that I got to get out of my system. I read it to you over the weekend. Oh, should we talk about the younger trip though before we go to what the X?
We can, yeah.
I guess we should have done that when we were talking. We'll punt that over to when we do our next beer. Okay, what the X?
What the X?
This quote comes from the Shepherds Conference 2024, which was at Grace Community Church, John MacArthur's church. Yes, once again, John MacArthur walks into my crosshairs was put on by John MacArthur. From what I understand, John MacArthur and John Piper.
Don't worry, Colton is aimed down his sights at Rick Warren at any moment.
That's right. Rick Piper and MacArthur are arguably the two biggest Reform pastors in the United States, big-time Calvinists. So, and if you think, like, what Reform? What are they reforming? They seem very old school. Reform comes from they're reforming they're reforming Christianity from Catholicism, and it's that kind of thing. It's not a new movement. It's an old centuries old.
I haven't gotten
movement.
to that chapter in the book yet, so.
So
I've only been explained to the Great Awakening so far. So,
and I referenced the upcoming Shepherds Conference when we talked about Alistair Berg dropping out because he deigned tell Granny that she should go to her grandkids' LGBTQ wedding. So that's where that came up, and he got himself in hot water. Was supposed to be one of the keynote speakers, and they said, "Yeah, maybe not. Shouldn't come." Okay, so with all that wind up, I have a quote from a pastor, Steve Lawson. He's fairly well known. He's written books. He's nobody. He runs a fairly large church in the United States, and he said from the pulpit, and I love somebody on X said, "I would like to know what scripture he preached this gem out of." Yeah, me too. He said, and this is one where I don't have a problem quoting out of quote-unquote context. He said, Steve Lawson, Jesus isn't coming to save, he's coming to slaughter. He isn't coming to deliver, he's coming to destroy and damn. So, I'm sure it was some nonsense out of the book of Revelation. But, yeah, so, how's that for the gospel?
yeah, so like Tim and I have started, or I don't know if Tim started yet, but we have this book called the Evangelicals. It's by Francis Fitzgerald, and I was kind of referencing it earlier when I talked about I'm kind of just at the Great Awakenings part, and what initially started the Great Awakenings, the two Great Awakenings that are often talked about in American circles, is you have the first Great Awakening, which happens before the American Revolution, and then you have the second Great Awakening, which happens, and it kind of, and this one goes for a long time. It's not like it's a 2-year movement or something like that. It's something that lasts almost like 60 years, 70 years, and really what you're actually finding from that is kind of this breakaway from this Calvinistic structure of there are the select elite, kind of where almost Christianity for this long time was a part of this elitist category. Now, you may not have been a part of the elite as far as like financially elite,
Right.
But you could have been a part of the select few where almost Christianity took on a Jewish.
You were a Christian gatekeeper.
You are a Christian Jew. It was God has now selected us as
we're the
new chosen people.
Chosen people. Yeah,
and so therefore this is what we have to do in order enough to attain this. And so a lot of the preaching that existed outside of that before the first Great Awakening was really about how terrible the rest of the world is. How God has damned everybody else, and we're just here at this time, and we're waiting for him to come back and either bring about a new age or destroy everybody else. And if you're Calvinist, that's the line of thinking that you are constantly going to be behind, because you are locked into that mode of thinking where yes, you are a part of this Christian elite where and it's very easy to sit there and point the finger at everybody that is not a part of your circle by sitting there and saying you're damned, you're damned, you're damned, because that's honestly what you believe.
Right.
Like that's at the core of your faith, is that Jesus did not come to save. Nobody else is saved. That we've already been predetermined.
Right.
As to who is saved. and so therefore he's going to kill off these masses. And the reason why the first Great Awakening happened was it actually started in a small church in Massachusetts, where somebody he gave the typical sermon, but then at the very end added hope at the end. And so people came from miles around. At one point he had everybody in the town that he was in as a part of the congregation, because all it was he simply offered that there was a way out. There was a way to be saved from this. And that's what sparked what became as the First Great Awakening. It wasn't I'm doomed and I'm fucked for eternity. It was I could buy in on this, where I could be a part of this, and I'm not a part of the chosen elite, at least not right now. And so when somebody does this on Twitter or something like that, is you are now making things a lot more difficult for people. Where again, that doesn't gain much traction. You might get followers or other Calvinists to be like, here, and all that kind of stuff. But that's not what God's kingdom is all about. And so if you're sitting there and you're saying that this is what he came to do, it's like, I like what you said, where you're like, I want to know what scripture you got this from, because like, where are you getting this from? And where he gets it from is the biblical school of thought that he has aligned himself with and what people have aligned themselves with for centuries of time now.
Well, I think somebody else posted something real quick that I think also gives an insight. I would say the problem with, I don't know enough about Calvinism to know if this has always been an issue, but I would say modern Calvinists who merged with maybe not 100% dispensationalism, but a lot of it. And I think this is why a lot of people are turned off by a big swath of modern Christianity, is so much of it is now, it is anchored in Revelation, and it's not anchored in the four Gospels. And yeah, they'll preach all the four Gospels and what Jesus said, but it's always, instead of teaching Revelation to wind up Jesus and the cross, Jesus and the cross are taught to wind up this ending where there's this great judgment, so we can feel good about ourselves that we're gonna, if some of us believe this, we're gonna be saved from the savage slaughter of all of those who have deigned to not bow down at the feet of Jesus, and which is another heavy thing in Calvinism, this kingship thing, which they would say is rooted in biblical, in the Bible. And I would say, no, actually it's not. You're right. You've added in a lot of stuff, but that's a discussion for another day. But I think this is, dollars to donuts. He is talking about Revelation and how Jesus is going to come back and condemn everybody. And so we're supposed to, all of this group of a couple thousand men sitting in a room are supposed to feel good about ourselves because Jesus is going to save us from the depravity of the world and judge them, and as he said, slaughter and destroy and damn them. So this guy says, Revelation reads a lot different when you realize that the blood of Jesus' robe is dipped in his own. And that's a reference to Jesus coming back on a horse, and it's a red robe, dripping in blood. And so, yeah, when you realize that's him, that's something, because it's dripping because he's already sacrificed. But when you look at it as he's coming, it's dripped in red because he's coming with his army of angels and whatnot to destroy the world. It's like, okay, that's a totally different spin on this. So, and as I've mentioned before, you're basing too large of your Christian view is based on a book that from the very beginning has had questions as to whether or not it should be in canon. And that's not to say that you can't read it and that it should be banned and that it's unbiblical. But like a lot of other books that did make it into the Bible, like the book of Enoch and the book of Moses and other books in the New Testament, letters that were in the New Testament were seen as redundant or we're not really sure. that's where this book was early on when they were putting together what we know as the Bible. And even throughout Christianity, there's always been debate as whether or not this book out of nowhere, supposedly written by John, is something that needs to be canon, that we're basing biblical worldviews on. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And a large part of the church, particularly in late 20th century, has had their entire worldview based on this one strange apocalyptic book that I don't think had any, that is so, when it was written, was written so particularly for the people reading it that I think it's way outside of our depth to be able to fully understand it.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to shift this into a whole Revelation talk, but I will say just about Revelation, which I've disclosed on this podcast before, it is a very specific genre. The genre doesn't exist today. So if you're reading it like most people do, and the hard part is most people read it like they read the Gospels, as far as it's this narrative piece.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, he experiences this dream, and like we're experiencing this dream with him, and it's like there's only 2 examples in scriptures of apocalyptic literature, and also people like the word like apocalyptic. They're like, because you think of the apocalypse. Which
is a human trait. All of mankind forever has had a fixation with end times.
And they have a fixation with end times. I was like, you look at lots of different, cultures around the world have some sort of version of like Ragnarok, that kind of stuff. But so it's just the title of this particular genre. It doesn't mean it's showing the apocalypse. That's not what it means. It just kind of just like poetry, like it's like poetry or fiction. It has that root word of apoca, and everybody's like, it's the end of the world, and it's like, no, that's not what it's about. But it's just, so it's apocalyptic literature. The only other scriptural is the tail end of the book of Daniel has apocalyptic literature literature in it, and so that's where you get his dreams, and people are like, it's prophetic. It's usually actually retrospective, so whoever wrote it, and based off of the oldest manuscripts that we have of that particular text, it's usually in reflection, with the hopeful message moving forward. So usually you reflect on a terrible past, and then you promote, and this is true with most apocalyptic literature around this time. It was really popular, but it was only popular for probably about like 250 years. And so the message becomes really retrospective. So again, what Tim was talking about is they recognize the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Actually, Revelation tells a part of the resurrection story. That's like a huge part of Revelation. And then it talks about the Christian persecution in Rome, and really just how the followers are supposed to move forward from that, to stay strong in their faith and to be encouraged. But a lot of people don't really recognize that. They don't really understand what that's talking about. Instead, they make it to where it's talking about, as Tim says, it defines our theology for today.
Right.
But that comes from not understanding. And the hard part is that this guy that's putting this has probably had has a pretty good biblical schooling.
Yeah. He's probably gone to Dallas Seminary or some other school.
Yeah, where it's like, you've been there, but this is where, again, if your teachers all growing up told you that 2 + 2 = 6 the entire time, then you're going to sit there and continue. And if you don't sit there and try to find other people who might say that it's different, You're going to go out to the world and continue to tell people that 2 + 2 = 6, and you might influence other people to believe that 2 + 2 = 6 because of what it is that you're going out there and saying, as opposed to fact checking and really getting into the nitty gritty parts of the faith. It's frustrating.
Well, Mr. Lawson, I don't believe you're not a Jesus follower.
No, I don't think that at all.
I don't think you're helping increase the kingdom, though, either. I think your kind of message just is preaching to the choir. So
Preaching to your own choir.
Yeah, preaching to a particular choir.
Yeah, I'm like, golly.
People preaching to a barbershop quartet. So, all right, that's our only one. What the X?
I gotta go get the next.
All right, I have one minor. It's a real quick cleanup. On the last episode, this is March 19th. So the episode we dropped this week, which was, what was it? Oh, so the first part of core principles of being a Jesus follower, I made, because which we're going to continue tonight with part 2, and hopefully just part 2, not part 3. I mentioned that these core principles were something that our pastor Forrest Jenin had put forth, and that I largely agreed with him, but I didn't agree with everything. And then just in general, you need to have a healthy perspective on your pastor, not lap up everything they say. Don't think these are like tremendous men of God who can't sin and disappoint you. And I stand by all that. But I also said, one of the reasons why I go to, I like Forrest is I like him personally, etc. And when I heard that, when I was editing the podcast, I thought, you know what, I need to insert in there something that's very important, because I think it goes along with kind of why we talk about what we talk about on the podcast, which is church and why church works and why church doesn't work. And the reason why I go to neighborhood church and why I really like Pastor Forrest is because I know that man has a mission and vision for that church, not only within the confines of that campus, but the city. And he holds that church accountable to it. And everything that church does falls in line with that mission and vision. And that is something that I appreciate a lot, because a lot of pastors don't. They fly by the seat of their pants. They're not forward thinking. They're not holding themselves accountable. They're not constantly holding the staff accountable. And I know from talking to people who are on staff at that church, they don't always get it right. I don't mean to say that they're perfect on that either, but they are constantly working and working and working. Is what we're doing here, or what we're spending our money on, is that in line with the mission and vision? And so that's the kind of church you want to find. That's the kind of pastor you want, because too many times pastors don't have that, and on a whim they'll just change something that the church is doing. You're like, wait, what? How did that happen? And so find a church where hopefully they're honest about why they exist and what they're trying to do. If they're not, you probably need to go somewhere else, because they're probably just kind of there to exist and not accomplish much. But so Forrest doesn't listen to this podcast as far as I'm aware, but I just felt like I need to be really more honest about why, because again, we need to find more pastors like that are very determined and deliberate about what they're doing, day to day, week to week, month to month. And one last thing, and I like this guy because every 2 years he gets really uncomfortable and thinks, how can I blow this up so my staff isn't getting comfortable and the church isn't getting comfortable? And I like that as well. Keep people on their toes, keep shaking them up. Don't let people get into their ways and just think like, oh, this is easy, we're just going to exist and kind of do, like, the mission vision hasn't changed. So I very much like this guy. He is very much, if he wasn't running a church, I'd hire him for my business, because he'd fit in line right along with how I try to run my business. So, all right, main topic. We're getting back to core principles of being a Jesus follower, which again were presented at Neighborhood Church by Forrest Jenin. Part 1, we talked about. Let me bring them up. All right, part 1. We went through 7 principles of being a Jesus follower. And again, this doesn't have to be. This is what our church, as a Jesus follower, well, you want to? Can you? Do you think you can explain what being a Jesus church means? For those that are listening, because a lot of people might be like, well, what does that mean? Every church is a Jesus church, but I think our church does a really quick, succinct job of trying to explain the difference.
Yeah, you have a Jesus-centered church is usually the idea where, again, as we've talked about on this podcast, is when we look to the core of who Jesus is. Everything that we do looks through the lens of Jesus Christ and who we know him to be. And it's actually how Tim and I structure this podcast.
Correct.
So if we ever are talking about who God is and who his character is, we always look to Jesus first to be able to see the Father. And so when we talk about churches that are Jesus-centered, you may see that they actually don't get distracted by a lot of some things that bog down other churches, where people will be like, well, how do you deal with contradictions in the Bible or whatever? And it's like, well, Jesus is the center, and I view the Father through the lens of Jesus, and so therefore I am able to see God as Jesus. And what they have committed themselves to is they have committed themselves to followers of Jesus, not necessarily followers of the Bible.
Yes.
And I know that a lot of people are like, well, how can you do both? Especially when they talk about, the Word was God, and again, there's a lot of Greek in there. But again, it's this idea, or that all Scripture is God breathed or whatever. Which is so funny because that was written and nobody. There wasn't a New Testament to speak of at that point.
That's right.
That all Scripture is God breathed. So there is this idea that we choose to follow Jesus, and who he is, and as he is revealed through the 4 Gospels, and then from there, we then see God through there. And so our church and our response is constantly acting towards following Jesus's model and his representation of who God is. And we believe that is God, is Jesus, and so we follow him through that. So we don't think that there is, you might hear that, God is kind of this big baddie, and then Jesus is this loving kind of guy, and so they kind of have these contradictory elements, but actually our church believes that they are one, and the way that we see, like I said, the way that we see the Father is through the Son. And yeah, I think that if I feel like if there's any questions on that, that should kind of almost be summed up in that, where, again, most of the time when our church will reference anything, it's usually a reference to what Jesus has done, as a way of being able to progress through things and that kind of stuff. So, yep, we're a Jesus-centered church.
Okay.
So we don't focus a lot on the Old Testament, by the way.
No, we don't. In fact, when we do, it's usually because people are like, what the hell's up with that story in the Old Testament?
And so what we find is, or what we attempt to do is, so if we do bring up Old Testament, is how do we see Matthew, Mark, Luke's, and John's depiction of Jesus as God in this story?
Right.
Can we see that depiction in this story? And we're not projecting, so to speak, but so much as, all right, if we accept this truth that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of who God is and his character, then how do we then see that character throughout Scripture, and previous Scripture?
Right.
And so that becomes a huge focus.
Correct. Okay. So these are going to be, so again, core principles for being a Jesus follower. This is going to be, I'll read what we got started so everybody can kind of get a reminder of what we did a couple weeks ago, and then we'll get into it. And a lot of what this is actually pointing out differences of what core principles at Neighborhood Church, and I would say this podcast, because we're Jesus centered, you'll see what it means, how being a Jesus centered person can differ a lot with how the church is today or how the church has been. And a lot of this is how the church has been, because I don't think that we would argue that the church hasn't been for a long time, or in a lot of cases throughout the history of the church, it's gotten away from being Jesus centered and it's gotten focused on other things. And so that's kind of a lot of what we're gonna go through tonight. So, and at the end of this, it'll kind of give you an idea of this. Kind of gives me an idea how I'm supposed to go day to day, interact with people in terms of how do I love people who are have a lot of problems, who've hurt me, and that kind of thing. So, all right. So, reminding us what we did earlier: 7 principles. These are 7 principles to be a Jesus follower. People aren't the enemy. Just because they do bad thing doesn't mean we have to not like them. Be gentle and respectful. The tone matters in how we address people. Be wise and full of grace. Do good to everyone. You're an ambassador, not a culture warrior. That's one we have not done well, particularly since the 80s and the rise of the Christian right. Be kind and work hard and live quietly. All right, the last one's a little but those are good principles to live by as Jesus follower. And actually on the last one, work hard and live quietly. That's not actually a small thing. The New Testament in several places talks about if you're a Jesus follower, you're expected to work. You're not allowed to be a deadbeat and live off others in the church or the government or whatever. You're supposed to, whatever means possible you can do to provide for yourself, you're called to do that.
Tim's libertarianism is coming out here, people.
I'm sorry, it's true. Okay. Next part. Last 100 years, we've ignored Paul and Peter. Instead, we've done set up defensive outposts, tried to create purity Bibles and litmus tests, and sought control through political power. 100% agree on that. I think Colton referenced the book that he and I are both reading. I think we're going to have a lot to talk about this as we dive into this book and give actual examples from this academic book that we bought that goes into detail about how the church has sought control through political power. And if you're wondering look, that shouldn't be, that is not that's not a controversial statement. It's been clear since Roe v. Wade, the church has tried to regulate morality, whether it be abortion through the state, preventing the legalization of homosexuality, then fighting the legalization of gay people, and then now we see all the LGBT stuff. And every single time, the church wants to grab the political tool and use the government in order to stop these things. And it's not a small part of the church. I would say it's the majority of the church. And we've talked about it sometimes on the show already. I understand that when you have kids and you're worried about these things that you find are immoral are going to impact your children. But using the political tool instead of maybe unplugging from the culture or minimizing the culture that's actually doing the work, we lean for the political thing because it's much easier to just ban stuff and then not have to worry about it rather than be mindful of what my kids are watching on the internet or on television, and then have a conversation about it, or they have an LGBTQ kid in their class and say, yeah, honey, from our perspective, they're confused, but that doesn't mean we don't love them as much as anybody else, and have those things. We just want to say, like, nope, bad thing, turn it off. How can we ban it and make people go to jail or whatever because we don't like this thing? That is the definition of the religious right. Right there. And you could also argue there's things on the religious left that also is the same thing. So
I think sought control through political power is always a really difficult one. We've spoken out against it several times on here. My biggest concern is please don't let it take your happiness. Don't let it take your soul. And there's difficult things with politics and trying to run a civilization, because that's ultimately what government does. Is
correct.
How do we civilize ourselves?
Correct.
And so what is permissible and what is not? And that's ultimately a moral question that we then evolve in an ethical question. So what is the mass majority of our moral system in our country, and how does that? And so therefore we produce our ethical model based off of that. So like if you went to the polls, and I mean, like, I'll give you an extreme situation because it's not in the polls, is methamphetamine. Should methamphetamine be able to be freely purchased by anybody in the country? It's not rhetorical, Tim. What do you think?
No. Well, actually, I don't know.
Yeah, if we actually go constitutionally,
pardon.
Do we go constitutionally? If we go constitutionally,
well, constitutionally, all right. You're now walked into it. Constitutionally, every state in the country has a right to ban it. The federal government does not. That's my constitutional answer.
Sure, if we took it to the state government.
My practical answer is watching the damage that's been done by the war on drugs. We see that it's not solved anything, and I do agree that it's thrown a lot of people in jail for. So it's caused a lot of trouble. It's wasted a lot of money, and so ultimately.
But even if it's not at the federal level, okay, let's do it at the state level. Should the state of California permit the use of methamphetamine?
Yes, it should ban it, but understand that that's not going to stop it. And
you're saying that it should ban it?
I think it's perfectly fine for the state to ban it. Here's the problem. Well, here's.
Oh, you're fine.
I think this wraps into what you and I are both saying. You can ban everything you want, but as long as the culture, we've had a culture shift. That's the problem. And so, if the culture doesn't give a damn about the consequences of going to jail for doing methamphetamine or taking 30 years off their life and because there's no jobs left, whatever the reasons are that we have this problem where people are on drugs. You can ban everything you want, but until the culture changes, all you're doing is throwing people in jail. You're not solving the problem. You're not stopping it.
Oh yeah, well, but here's also the thing is, okay, so we take methamphetamine out of the equation, so we say, okay, all right, that one is maybe too far of a stretch for people. Okay, so then let's do something that's not a far stretch for people. Let's do alcohol or tobacco. Or let's do something that everybody consumes on a regular basis, and let's take it away from them and let's do caffeine.
Well, we tried that with alcohol, and that was out of a temperance movement that came out of a Christian movement, not completely, but a largely Christian movement. It had enough traction that it became it went through all the steps, which are not easy to do, to become a amendment to the Constitution. And then quickly everyone said, wait, what did we do? This sucks. So again, if the culture's not behind, look, I hate to say it, but if the culture 30 years from now, because on the trajectory we're going with sexual stuff, if the culture decides sex with someone over 12 years old isn't a big deal, you can lock people all you want up, but if people have now convinced themselves because of the internet and talking to people like, oh, you're into that thing too? That's not a big deal. The law doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
All you're doing is locking up people but you're not changing hearts and minds. And I think that's what both sides of the political aisle have found since the 60s is we're trying to use the government to change hearts and minds instead of change hearts and minds.
Yeah, and so you go into the voters box every 4 years, and
because the voters box is the easy thing to do.
Yeah, and so you go in there and you vote for your own personal preference. And if you're being, and I think we've already discussed it on this podcast before. Tim, would you ever vote for? Would you ever vote for abortion to be legalized?
No,
me neither.
But I wouldn't. But I wouldn't lose sleep if it got passed.
I wouldn't lose sleep if it got passed. But but it's the idea of, again, it's a moral issue with us.
Sure.
And so therefore it becomes a difficult issue. And if somebody feels strongly morally about it and they're trying to convince other people to be on the same moral ground as them, again, it's like sought control through political power. And I mean, and here's the honest truth to it. And we have to acknowledge this too, is yes, I recognize that is a life, but I do recognize that it is a life. I almost view it through the lens of Christianity, is where this is something that I view that is, but if I was an atheist and I didn't believe that God was a part of the equation, I very much could have sat there and just been like, yeah, that's not a life yet. They're obviously not breathing
right
out in our air. And I could have made an argument for it. I still, as a Christian, so recognize that as, well, yeah, you can easily make an argument that is a parasite, because there is no, you can make a reference, or you can make a claim that an infant growing in a mother's womb is a parasite because it is stealing nutrients from the mother throughout the entire process, and there is no gain. And people are like, oh, there's emotional gain, or there's whatever. And it's like, nope, based off of the different types of relationships that exist biologically,
right?
An infant is not anything other than a parasite, if you look on it at that scale. And so some people who are listening to this podcast might be offended, but again, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying
the flip side is is the euthanasia side, which has also increased dramatically since the 1970s. This idea that I'm just a parasite on the world. I'm a burden to my family. I'm a burden to the government. I'm a burden to myself. Life isn't worth living without a quality of life, and so I'm going to terminate my life. And so
right, and so there's this moral, and so you cannot acknowledge that people are going to go into the voting box and they are going to use their own moral judgment, because we all have a different moral judgment. We may all agree to an ethical model, which then becomes the law in our area, and then we vote on those ethical issues on a regular basis, or some of those ethical issues on a regular basis, but we are not free from being morally. We have to vote based off of our own morals, and we will try to convince people of our own morals on a regular basis. And so when it says we sought control through political power, yeah, everyone does.
Well, I think there's a difference between individuals voting and what we've seen since the 80s, which was the rise of this overt
from the Ronald Reagan and again
the Jerry Falwell's moral majority, and then the replacement of it in the 90s, which I can't remember the name of. I mean, I think that is more politics bastardizing the church than the church seeking to.
But we still use it in the voting box, and where it's like, okay, so in 2008, when it came down to the whether or not there should be a legalization of homosexual marriage in our country, it didn't pass.
I know. I think there is a narrow but profound difference between Christians doing that individually and.
But what if they? But again, this is politics. Politics is that idea that comes from the individual, to which it then steamrolls into a massive group based off of. Now, it does come with compromise, right? That's why a Republican and a Democratic candidate gets voted in every single year. And I don't know anybody that would sit there and say that Joe Biden actually represents from top to bottom every single part of their Democratic stance. And I don't believe that anybody that voted for Donald Trump believes that. Well, and I mean, I say don't believe. There's a very few minority that believes from top to bottom Donald Trump represents everything that they stand for as a voter on the political scan. But that's where, again, you continue to compromise through this process to where you eventually get a massive following and you go from there. And to where you say, and you get as many people as you can in the voters box on Friday. If a pastor got in there and said, on a Sunday morning, said, guys, there is an assault on Christianity in America, and they are wanting to legalize methamphetamines for other people. And they could sit there and they could say, this could cause health defects or whatever, and blah, 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 blah. And we've been fighting so hard to help people that are struggling with addiction and blah, 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 blah. And if a pastor said that on a Sunday morning, I mean, one, I'd be appalled because that's just not what I'm a part of. But there's a large part of the country that would be completely okay with that. And well, to which, but I would still go on a vote on a morning, and I would not vote for methamphetamines to be legalized in the country. And so what you're saying is my reaction versus a pastoral in leadership? Like, I don't.
No.
Well, I don't know. Explain yourself.
No. I think what Forrest is talking about in this, and what I'm talking about, is mass movements of Christians overtly trying to control the Republican Party in the form of Jerry Falwell and his religious right movement, and Ralph Reed and his Christian Coalition group in the 90s, and Pat Robertson, who was a very prominent, ran for president and had a very prominent Christian television network. I think when it gets to that level, you've gotten way over your skis, and you are now allowing politics to pollute Christianity than the other way around. I have no problem with the pastor standing up and saying, look, we have a problem with drug addiction in this country, and we need to both vote not to allow these things to be legal for our children to have access to, but also have compassion. I will note it is illegal for a pastor to stand up, and you're not actually supposed to politic from the pulpit. You lose that's a violation of your non-tax status. But not to make this a race thing, black pastors get away with this all the time by talking about what candidate to vote for. They're not supposed to do that. But to be fair, a lot of white pastors have started doing that also. So, again, like I said, it's a fine line, but I think it's a very bright line of Christians. Look, it goes back to a lot. I think in a lot of ways you and I are agreeing. We're just not getting there. It's kind of the crux of the show. The whole crux of the reason why we started this show is I think a lot of Christians are, if they're really being honest with themselves, are conservative first. And there's also a group that's progressive first. And then they find a way to wrap their Bible and their Christianity around what their political beliefs rather than the other way around. And the problem with that is, one, that's not how it's supposed to work. But two, it drips their political language around the veneer of Jesus, which it wasn't intended to be. And so, yes, we live in the world. We're supposed to be in the world, of the world, in the world, but not of the world. We are in the world. We need to vote. I think one of the reasons why some of these difficult issues like abortion and stuff that gets argued over, I've come to the conclusion, if you can't come up with a secular reason to support your belief, and it's just a religious one, it's probably not a thing you should be voting on.
Right.
And you laid out a really good, you're pretty much, it's likely you're going to be at least a believer in God, maybe not religious, for believing, for being pro-life. But I think, one can be non-religious, maybe just be like a big non-universalistic God believer and say, no, this is just too much for me. The science is showing more and more that these are actually babies earlier than we think, and now we're getting to where a baby gets delivered early at 6 months, and we're able to keep it alive. It's like, I'm now getting uncomfortable with this. And so you can make that argument. And I think as Christians, I think we have to be able to make what's the secular good for the country argument to support our thing. Because if we're only doing it because the Bible says, it's probably not a good enough reason to vote on that thing.
No, I think it's an okay reason to vote on a thing. I want to push back on that, where I think it's an I think it's an okay reason to vote on that thing. I don't think you can promote that thing.
Okay, that's a good way. Yeah. Okay, then which is what I was kind of saying. Yeah, sure.
I think that's what you were saying, but I think that
don't promote it. We're not promoting the Republican Party believes in this because the Bible says so.
No, and I'm not promoting it to even anybody else.
No, I'm just saying as an example.
No, yeah, 100%. But it's just like, okay, I know I'm going to go in there and just morally, I just can't get behind that. And if that's all it is, and that's still your vote, then that's okay. But if you're just sitting there and you're like, and you go out with people and you're just like, oh man, you voted for that? I don't know how you can morally get behind that. And it's like, you have to sit there and you do have, and I think that it's perfectly acceptable in our country these days. And most people don't think so, because usually people are trying to stretch it a little bit further. But if you sat there and said, that's my religious perspective, or that's my religious take on that, and you sat there and that's just what you held, but you're not trying to necessarily, and I know that people think that that's how you spread evangelism.
Right.
If you just sat there and say, that is just my religious belief, people would be like, oh, okay. And they would accept you for that.
Exactly.
They'd just be like, oh, okay, that's just what you observe.
Correct.
And it's like, okay, I don't agree with that, but I understand that you're observing a religious, moral system or whatever, and so therefore, that's just what you think. There may be one person who might push back on you.
Correct.
But when you sit there and you're trying to sway the group because you think that's how to do evangelism, is by sitting there and saying, we need votes, and so therefore this or that, and you almost kind of weaponize Christianity, as we've talked about before.
100%. Absolutely. I think you synthesized it perfectly. Exactly. Vote with your conscience. Somebody asks why. Yeah, I voted against gay marriage. Why? It's just what I believe.
100%.
Oh,
well, that's
okay.
why I brought up gay marriage earlier.
But
it's just like,
but it's not. How dare you vote for this? That's not. That's immoral. It's this. It's a difference between being offensive and passive, I think, in how we approach it. And I think the point that it's being made here was the church was very overt and offensive in trying to stop the moral retreat, and it didn't help anything. And in a lot of cases, it just turned people off from the church. Of this is just another group of people trying to. Not only do you have the government trying to control me, I got a bunch of crazy Christians from the South trying to control me.
Right, and in my belief,
and that no disrespect to the people from the South, but I mean that's how it came across.
But and to talk about what Tim talked about at the very beginning of when we talked about this last 100 years, we've ignored Paul and Peter, and we kind of went to the sought control through political power. One of the things that I like that Tim said is, and this is something that Tim and I know we both believe in, is we believe in a cultural shift. And so in order for that change to happen, one, it has to happen over time.
Yes.
And two, it has to be through loving relationships with those people that you are then able to, if you want people to change, that's how you get people to change.
Open arms, not closed fists.
No, and also, but here's the thing: is don't have ulterior motives where
Correct.
you're like, okay, so I'm gonna love them for a little bit, and then hopefully they're gonna switch.
Don't
their
be a people pleaser.
I was like,
or
that's not what I'm.
No.
That's not what I'm getting from this subject, right?
Mm-mm.
Like,
Mm-mm.
what I'm saying though is that change can happen through loving one another and breaking bread with people and people getting to understand why you have those moral values and why you vote that way. Because that might be a great form of discussion one day after you've been loving on this person for a year or two, and they're like, hey, how'd you vote on this particular subject? And you're like, well, I voted this way. And they're like, oh, no way. Why? And you're like, well, it's just my religious belief went that way. And it's like, well, why? Well, why is it that your religious belief has that as that? And I'm like, well, let me tell you about it.
Right.
And through that honest, genuine conversation and relationship, you're then able to have stuff. Again, we're reading a book on evangelicals and all that kind of stuff, and how, yes, I agree with Tim. Within the last 50 years in our country, there's been as according to this book, I don't think it's 100 years. I think that's pretty.
Yeah, no, it started 100 years, I think, comes from around the Billy Graham revivals, but I don't know that how much Billy Graham. Yeah, I would say it really started in the 80s with Reagan getting elected in this.
And just before Reagan getting elected, yeah.
Right. Well, Reagan was the culmination of, and it's this reaction to the 60s and the countercultural movement.
Yeah.
And TV becoming a truly mass communication platform where we see in the 80s cable television comes along, and so we're starting to see more and more channels, like HBO comes online, I think.
That darn MTV.
Yeah, well, but it accesses people to all kinds of stuff they've never seen before. Technology is always the driving force of immorality, or opens up the world to immorality we've never seen before, and causes all kinds of social upheaval. And so usually if you're trying to find out what happened, it's technology, and it's never like when this thing got invented, but when it became fully adopted. And televisions didn't fully become adopted until mid 70s, and then in the 80s and probably early to mid 80s, televisions became cheap enough that households had at least one, probably one, if not two, color TVs, and then multiple black and white TVs, and so you're accessing all that, and then throwing in there. Yes, we'd had books for hundreds of years, but books are very easily reproduced at a mass scale. We've got radio, and so we're living in this world right before the internet then takes that and turns it on its head, and injects a massive amount of steroids into that. We have pretty much before the internet, mass communication is mature in the 80s, and it's causing all these issues. So, all right, one other point on this. I also agree with the second point. Try to create purity Bibles and litmus tests. Look, we've talked about this all the time. This is the part. This is more internal. Well, it's internal and external, but Christians unfortunately aren't any different than anybody else in the rest of the world. We like to create our litmus tests and our purity tests in order to figure out why we're better than other people, and we can exclude people from our group. And so 100%, as the church matured, we continue to see more and more in translations of the Bible and people coming up with theories about that. It became a very easy way for people to say, I don't agree with that, and I'm not comfortable enough to just say I don't agree with that, but that's actually heretical, and doesn't have anything to do with what has been known to be what the church believes since the beginning of the church, and what Jesus said, which is 99.9% bullshit. When someone says that, it's probably untrue, because the church has changed quite a bit on the vast majority of views that Christians hold for the 2,000 years that it's been around.
I agree.
And so when you hear someone saying, I don't agree with that, and I'm not sure a Jesus follower, like earlier on, Mr. Lawson, I find his view of how Jesus is going to what we quoted, I find that repugnant. I would not say that he's not a Jesus follower. I would just hope that man would have a softening of his heart. But it's not, doesn't mean that I don't think it's the correct view of the gospel, but I don't think it's, it doesn't make him an unbeliever and someone who's outside the church, like so many like to say. So we're, like I said, we're going through a couple. We're going through 3.
We've gotten through one bullet point.
What?
I said we've gotten through one black bullet
I know.
point.
We've got 3. Maybe we'll just finish after the 3 areas where the church hasn't been very good and caused issues. So
Where the hell is that?
what?
Where's that?
We did one last 100 years, ignored by Paul and Peter. Sorry, we're reading from a script.
Then I have Acts 10 and
Acts
11.
10:11. Too many Christians are strong in commitment and weak in love.
Oh, okay. That's where you want to end at?
No, and then the next one, weeds or whatever Christian boogeymen.
I just don't see the 3 things.
Well, I know there's 3 of them.
Oh, yeah, because you went to the focus group.
No, I'm reading. I'm quickly able to do my both language and my math at the same time.
I'm just saying there's no breakdown.
There's no number, I know, but
There's no title or subheading.
I understand. I'm doing it on the fly.
Okay. Acts 10 and 11, too many Christians are strong in commitment and weak in love. Wow, that's pretty bold to make after the church has only been around for 2 weeks in Acts 10 and 11.
So, Colton, do you know off the top of your head what Acts 10 and 11 is?
No.
Okay. I wouldn't either. Just so
I was like,
know.
what?
Acts 10 and 11. So
We're
that
talking about
is
the books, obviously, right?
yeah, chapter 10, chapter and 11.
Okay, got it.
Chapter 10 and 11 are Cornelius calling for Peter and Peter having his vision.
Okay. Okay, great. Too many Christians are strong in commitment and weak in love. So are we saying that Peter is too strong in his commitment?
Yeah, so do you want me or do you want to give a quick synopsis of the story?
No, you go for it.
Okay, so there's this man named Cornelius. He's a centurion, but he's already become a Christian. And look, the way the scripture writes, I don't know. I think it would be interesting to take a class at a seminary just to find out this. When the Bible talks about the head of a household becoming a Christian, it pretty much always references the entire family, the entire household, not family, the household becoming a believer. Correct?
Yeah.
I mean, generally speaking. And it's because, and you think, well, why is that? Well, it's a reflection of the cultural time.
Well, it's a reflection of the census.
Well, but it's also, let's say Cornelius, before he became a Jesus follower, was a follower of Dionysus and Jupiter, just to throw some names out. The whole household would follow
One
those.
of those gods was Greek, the other one was
I know,
fucking
I'm
Roman.
perfectly aware, but that's what came off the top of my head. But you might be both. So, the whole household is going to worship those things. The slaves who are not chattel slaves like in the South or in like 16th century anywhere around the world, but are more like indentured servants, what we talk about in early American history. I mean, some are slaves in Roman households are anything from pure property and they'll ride them to death till they die, and some are literally their right-hand man running the house, running the finances. So slave is a vague term in Roman culture.
Yeah, don't think of plantations.
This is not plantation. It's not to say that slaves are not treated equal in a Roman household. Some are the most trusted person in the household above the wife and the eldest son, and some are just pure property, and if one dies, I could give two shits. But in this culture, whoever the father the head of the household is, it's expected that the household's going to follow that God. So, Acts reads that Cornelius, who's a centurion, is known as the Italian regiment. He and all of his family are devout and God-fearing, and so he has this vision where he's supposed to reach out to Peter, and Cornelius sends out to Peter, correct? And then Peter has his own vision. And in Peter's vision, he's asked to eat all of these things which a Jew's not supposed to eat.
Yep.
And then Peter gets the summoning from Cornelius and shows up at Cornelius's house, and he and Cornelius and Peter are talking, and Peter mentions, well, I'm not even supposed to be associating with you, let alone eating the things that I had the vision about. Like, that's how Jews weren't supposed to be in good company with a Gentile.
Right.
So anyway, it's through this process that Peter's visions and his experience with Cornelius, for a very quick synopsis of it, is Peter comes to the conclusion that this isn't all about, the faith is not all about the Jews, but it's also for those that he has been told his entire life are unclean. And the things that are unclean are okay for Jesus followers. It's a good kind of...
Yeah, that works. Yeah.
Yeah. And the point of the story is to break down these ideas of cultural and even religious reasons for not engaging with people and loving people, and bringing those things down so that as a Jesus follower, we can now interact with these people and live in a way where we're not being offensive or creating boundaries or condemning them. And so it's under that. If you find that to be a not very good synopsis, then read it. It's chapter 10, chapter 11. It's pretty quick read. So it's under that guise that Forrest is saying in this, too many Christians are strong in commitment. Yeah, I agree. Too many of us are held to our purity tests. And not enough of us are open to loving other people.
I think that too many Christians are strong in commitment. I think the thing here to say is just we are really the easiest part of religion, whether you like it or not, and whether you agree with me or not, is always the part where you need to correct yourself.
Yeah.
As opposed to going out and loving other people that are significantly different than you, and that don't accept the same things that you do on a regular basis. Because I think as Christians, we all the time are trying to fix those people, we're trying to fix the situation, we're trying to do this and we're trying to do that. Because we're trying to get them, sorry for yawning, we're trying to get them to be committed at the same way that we are committed. And so through that process, we are weak in love, because everything has this ulterior motive where it is, okay, well, as soon as we're all in line together, then we can move forward, and then I can love you, where love becomes conditional. But that's just not what Christians are called to do, but that's yet what we experience on a regular basis from Christians.
I think this is a good moment to point out, look, there are two churches, very broadly speaking. And by that I don't mean Protestant and Catholic, or Protestant and Old Church being Catholic and Church of England and, Greek Orthodox. There are two churches. And those two churches are based on how you define that word love. And you and I would define that word love by openly engaging, in fact, sometimes intentionally engaging people we find that are icky, to use a terrible phrase, a cheap phrase, sophomoric phrase. And to not lean in, we're not leaning in with what their flaws are. And to what you pointed out a couple minutes ago, where it's also not a Trojan horse, a ruse, to kind of be nice to them so that when the moment occurs, we can pounce and say, you're a sinner because you're not doing this. That's one side of the church. Our side is, look, I'm going to engage these people and I'm not going to point out what their flaws and their errors are. I'm not going to point out even that they're not a Jesus follower. I'm just going to exist. And at some point, lean into witnessing to them being a Jesus follower, or just living out that I'm a Jesus follower, to where they think, like, why are you different? Why you seem to be the person at work that doesn't get worked up about the drama about what people are saying. I don't hear you gossiping about people. I hear you get frustrated with somebody, but you're not holding grudges, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
The other side of the church defines love as my demonstration of love is to point out to them what they're doing wrong, so that as soon as they do, the quicker they do, they understand that they fall short of the glory of God and need to accept Jesus and to save them. Is that a fair? That is the dividing line between the church.
Yeah.
And again, it's not a Catholic thing. It's not a Protestant thing. I think there are parts of the Catholic Church that have that dividing line, and there's certainly lines within the Protestant Church. That's the dividing line between. And look, one can have extremes on both. Well, I don't agree with the side that says my job of loving is to wag my finger at you and tell you how you're falling short, and then hope that the Holy Spirit's going to tell you, you're doing wrong, and then you become a Jesus follower. That works when people are at their depths, and they've got no place to go. But if you're dealing with people who generally have what they think is a good life, whether down deep inside they feel empty, that stuff's not going to work. But I also accept that on our side, one can be too loving and not be honest about what sin is and need to correct sin. So, but I think that anytime we talk about too many Christians are strong in love and commitment and weak, the key thing is, okay, well, how do we define love here? That's the critical part. And so What we're saying is we're very much good at being committed to what the Bible says we're supposed to do and not do, and we're going to tell our fellow believers what they're supposed to do and not do, and we're also going to tell the world that doesn't believe in Jesus what they're supposed to do and not do. And too many times it's not, look, I know you grew up in a household where your father beat you and your mother, and you never had a chance in life.
Right.
And I understand why you tick the way you do. And so it's not your fault. And all these angry things that you're doing, you've chosen to do because you lived a shitty childhood. There's an answer to that.
Yeah.
And instead, too many times we say, that guy's just a low down, dirty, rotten kid who's got no chance in life. I've heard that out of Christians. That should not be the mentality of any Christian.
No.
Okay. Number 3. Number 3. According to my list. Number 3. Weeds are whatever Christian boogeyman. What? Okay. So we're reading from Matthew 13:24-43. Certainly, Colton, you can tell us about the weeds parable.
Yeah, well, it's not a weeds parable, actually. It's the parable of the sower.
Okay, sure.
Correct.
Correct.
No, it's the parable of the sower. So I feel like this is an age-old parable. You've got the farmer; he's spreading out his seed. And through that process, the seed goes everywhere. The seed is the word of God. So that's the message that's being presented. And some seed lands here, some seed lands there. And we're saying what it talks about with the weeds is that there is a particular seed that grows up in the rocky soil, but the weeds come and they choke it out. And so therefore it's not able to grow and it dies. That's what it's talking about. There's several different types of seed where it's like, okay, the seed goes out and people don't even accept it, and the birds come and they pick it up. There's the seed that ends up on the shallows. Maybe it's the shallow soil where the weeds choke it. There's the rocky. No, I feel like it's the rocky soil.
Yeah, there's the rocky. There's 4 different kinds of soils, people.
Yeah, and then there's
with varying degree of.
And then it lands on the good soil, and therefore it's able to grow and to flourish.
Right.
So there you go. That is the parable of the seed. And yes, weeds are whatever Christian boogeymen.
Right, and so what is being referenced here is you'll hear a sermon preached on the parable of the seeds once or twice a year, and it's meant to shame you into being that person where the gospel doesn't either you listening, sitting in the church, you're not being that Christian you're supposed to be, because it's a two-way. It's used for two reasons. One, to weed out the Christians who really aren't strong Christians. They're just fake Christians, and so they die out. And then the weeds. So the point of this is a message meant to, again, create others, create boundaries, and a way to separate us, true believers, us true Christian followers, those of us who live nice moral lives and follow Jesus and the Word of God, and then create boundaries so those outside are others that we either say are going to be slaughtered and destroyed, as Steve Lawson said, or people that are a threat to my children or a threat to my life or whatever the thing is.
Right.
And there's a really good quote by a theologian, William Willimon, to illustrate this. From time to time, we have tried to clean up the church, removing from the rolls all the slackers, deadwood, and morally impure. Let's get this church pared down to the truly religious, the really committed, we said to ourselves. Invariably, we ended up with a church which more closely resembles the people who crucified Jesus rather than the ones who follow Jesus. And so again, I think this is the parable of the seed, the weeds, the parable of the sower is a way of trying to come up with the purity test for Christians. And the more you do that is you end up with, frankly, a lot of judgmental people who are no different than what the Gospels record as either the Pharisees or the Romans who are crucifying Jesus and mocking him, or saying he's not really who he says he is. Yeah. And yes, we spend a lot of time on the show pointing out things that we don't like that other Christians are saying. But, and again, hold us to the standard. If we go too far and you think we're going too far, our point isn't to do this and cast these people out and say they're not being true believers, but trying to hold them to a better standard. But usually the standard tests are based on morality tests and not Jesus follower loving others tests.
Yeah.
It's just the reinvention of the 10 Commandments.
Yes, no, there's yeah.
We for all of the hatred of some of us by the Ten Commandments, man loves the Ten Commandments. We love some kind of, whether it be Hammurabi or Moses in the Ten Commandments. Society loves having, these are the things thou cannot do. And it's not because we really want these things laid down so we know. It's because we can then point to others and say, well, at least I'm not that guy. At least I'm not that girl.
Well, I mean, I think back on the book of James, actually, for this part that I like a lot, is faith without deeds is dead.
Yeah, a very difficult passage for Protestants to balance. the least popular book of the New Testament.
But this is where people are like, but I do think that there is a sect that's like, if you're not doing anything, then get the fuck out. You know, if you're not helping out with the mission and the vision of Christ, you know, they talk about it where 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work.
Oh, yeah.
You know, where it's like, all right, well, if you're not...
Just had a meeting about that 3 weeks ago.
You mean the focus group? Yeah, I got you. No, it's idea, oh my gosh, only 20% of us are working. And so that 20% wants to feel... They want their jewels in heaven now.
Right.
Almost, where it's like, okay, now I want my crown. I want it anointed. I want people to recognize me for all that I've done. I don't know if it's an American thing. It might just be a person.
I think it's just a person
people
thing.
thing.
It's a person thing for sure. Thanks, Tank. It's a person thing for sure. And maybe Americans have taken it like we do on a lot of things, just to the whole next level. We just want to feel
recognized for all it is that we do. But really, actually, what we're talking about with the scriptures is you may never, ever, 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 ever get recognized. And that's not what matters. Because that's about you. It's about me. Way to sound like the fucking brother of the prodigal son.
The church has been built on people who've never been written about. It has not been written on the backs of, I'm sorry, Paul and Peter and Augustine and all these people we read about. The church has actually been built and grown on people that you and I have never read about. And that includes today. To your point, it's the drudgery of everyday life. It's usually not doing great things, right?
Yeah, no. Yeah.
It's putting up with someone at work that you can't stand and telling yourself, I don't like this person. But you know what? I need to find a way to be a peacemaker. Or I need to figure out a way so I don't have to interact with them so I can't be a jerk like everybody else is being a jerk. Whatever it is, but being a Christian is not big, grand things. And we want it to be, oh, I'm witnessing to people. I'm telling them about Jesus. It's not. All right, I think we can actually wrap this up because we're at 147 and that's minus. But we're not getting to episode 2 for sure.
We're not going to episode 2?
We're already on a third beer.
It's spring break.
Okay.
No, I gotta drive home.
Yeah, you gotta drive home. This is pre-baby. Yes, you could stay here, but okay. All right. So what does this mean? So we've gone through some negative things. So what does it mean to be a church and a Jesus follower who's Jesus centered? Okay, acceptance with honor and respect for those who we disagree with. Convicted civility. So we disagree with those. We don't back down on what we believe of. To Colton, what Colton was talking about, practically speaking, I am not going to back down for the fact that I am pro-life. I believe that every life at some point in and around conception is life, and I'm going to defend it. And I'm also going to defend life at the end of the stage. I do not accept euthanasia as a way that society should be accepting people to just say, my quality of life is a reason why people should be put to death. Humans have unimaginable ways of impacting people, and that includes people that we quote unquote deem to be a burden, whether it's at the beginning of life or the end of life. But we do so with civility, and we do so with humility. 2, when grace of Jesus sinks in, we will be amongst the least offended and most loving people of the world. And I think this is a big thing, because this is not how the church is led. So when we actually believe in Jesus and it sinks in, we don't get easily offended.
I think we'll still get easily offended.
Well, we shouldn't be, though. And look, I don't like pulling verses. I'm reminded of Paul saying, "Why are you offended by what the world does? The world doesn't believe in Jesus." I think that's in 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, I think there's. I think that we need to push towards being least offended. Our culture right now is offensive culture. And so I don't want to discredit you if you're somebody who's struggling with this and you're offended. It's okay to be offended. I don't think it's never not going to be okay to feel offended. There are going to be times where somebody's going to say something and you may not like it.
Well, to be fair, it does say least, and least is a big word, but I think we shouldn't be leading with offended. And I think too often Christians lead with being offended.
Yeah. If I'm offended, I'm not going to sit there but also this comes from the turn the other cheek mentality. So I get that in one aspect where, again, it is supposed to be and actually this is one of the things that a lot of people nowadays really don't like about our culture. Mm-hmm. Is the turn the other cheek mentality. Is somebody is not offended by an action that somebody else has done, but somebody sees that action and says that action is not okay because it can be offensive towards that person that was not offended.
A third party steps in and says that's offensive.
And I mean, like, that is the turn the other cheek mentality. Of where it's like, you may have gotten slapped across the face and you're just like, okay, I don't give two shits. Here, have the other one. But at the end of the day, should it happen in the first place? Is the question that's always being asked. And yeah, people are upset. They're offended. Some people not offended at all. And yes, you cannot be offended for another group. That's also something that can happen. But I don't know. It's a weird situation. But what I'm saying is that we do need to be a lot more patient when something is happening towards us. I'm not saying that you have to sit there and be okay with it. There are possibilities that you may be offended. But do accept grace towards that other person, and yes, we should be least likely to be offended than others.
So I'm gonna infer something in this. I think that'll clarify something, and I'm gonna infer on the part. Maybe this isn't what Forrest meant. I'm gonna infer. It's gonna
clarify nothing.
I'm gonna infer some clarity. I think. Look, it's fine to be offended by day-to-day, I don't like my kids showing up to school and everybody's got a smartphone and half the kids got access to Pornhub on their... That's perfectly... I understand that. I think what this is talking about is Christians being offended by the general culture of... It's when we get offended by mocking of Jesus, like the piss crucifixion art that was created in the early 90s where a guy put a crucifix in a jar of piss and made millions of dollars on it. Say what you will about it being lowbrow art, but it's those things that, again, going back to the culture war, Christians have been upset about Jesus being mocked and all that. And I don't, at the end, just, who cares? Yes, be eternally offended, but don't like run around with a chip on your shoulder and say, this is offensive. This is offensive to our culture. And to me, it's just like, look, Jesus was mocked before he got put on the cross. He was mocked as he was on the cross. This isn't anything new for Jesus.
Yeah. And
so to me, mocked by the world,
and
you're not doing any favors by making this some huge thing that, guess what? The world mocks Jesus.
Yeah, and it's nothing new for Ty Gibbs either.
That happens every week in my household. So I think that's a lot of where this comes from, is Christians getting uppity about Christian culture and being mocked. And it's like, get over yourselves. Yes, like I said, be offended about truly offensive moral things that even a non-Jesus believer would agree with. Like, I think this is a little too far. Like, I'm an atheist, but I don't want my 14-year-old exposed to this. Can we put some boundaries here? I think that's like good old-fashioned boundary creating and not necessarily offensiveness. But when we get upset because Christians are being mocked, oftentimes appropriately, for the stupid things we do and say, yeah, get over yourself. That's not a concern of ours. And then, so Forrest has a quote to just wrap that little bit up from N.T. Wright, one of my favorite modern-day theologians. The church's role is to not impose its views on society, but to demonstrate a different way of living. Our witness is not through culture wars, but through sacrificial love, justice, and reconciliation. So again, I think that wraps up those three little things very well, including what we started with. Too many times we try to use politics to do things, whether it be how we vote, our foreign policy, and what we should be doing is stepping out of ourselves and saying, you know what, I really support Israel, but I also think there needs to be a peace. We need to be peacemakers. How do we make peace here? I don't really have a dog in the fight within this particular political battle. How do I step out of myself and be a peacemaker? Like, I got two friends, and one's a Trump voter and one's a Biden voter, and I think both of them are crazy because I can't stand either. How do I, instead of just being like, hey, don't talk to me, just say, hey, guys, I think you're both crazy. You hate him, he hates you, I hate both of you. This is a great way to come together and
we hate
each other. Let's
Exactly.
hate each other in this hatred of each other. Let's come together. Okay, then let's wrap it up with a couple more. Understand the difference between core issues and peripheral issue and a peripheral issue. This is what we've talked about many times on the show. If you've been listening since the beginning, we've tried to point this out all the time. Most of what we get upset about and uppity about are peripheral issues. They have nothing to do with the salvation of Jesus Christ, his death on the cross, and we get upset about it either because the world doesn't agree or some other Christian doesn't agree, and then we tell that Christian, you're not a true Christian. Those are not the things we're supposed to be fighting about. Any thoughts?
I don't feel like I should give any more thoughts. We're trying to wrap up this episode.
You don't have to. You can save your thoughts for what it looks like and see if you agree.
No, I mean,
that.
we've talked about the core issues versus the.
We've talked about this quite a bit.
It's just the idea of
it's
the doctrine versus versus the realm of opinion, and even before that is the dogmas. We get so focused on opinion-based shit that we don't have a good enough conversation about. And we are willing to write off people that are not associated with the doctrine that we align ourselves with or the opinion that we align ourselves with. And so therefore we focus so much on that stuff that we don't even spend time working on what we're supposed to accomplish as believers. And I mean, that was one of the main reasons why we started this podcast, was we were just like, man, so many people are just like, golly, you want to die on this fucking hill, but it's not even a hill to die on. you dying on the plains.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's just, man, dude. So frustrating. So, yeah, that's ultimately what he meant by that. You just said it in a nicer way.
He did, and then he breaks it down in very churchy language, which in 3 different ways, which I won't read because it's, even for me, it's too churchy. But yeah, it's basically just this idea of we fight over these stupid things that just don't really matter, and we turn them into big battles, which then draw.
No, we're gonna say them just because if you're sitting there and you're like, I don't know what the difference is.
Okay, yeah.
Well, number one, when the topic doesn't involve a matter of basic Christian orthodoxy, such as we find in the great ecumenical creeds. Okay, so that's one of the things that is often argued about. When the debate brings 2 or more biblical truths into dynamic tension so that both parties make reasonable appeals to Scripture. And 3, when faithful Christians take different views on the issue, do you part to make the church the safest place in the world to engage cultural issues? And so there you go. Those are the 3.
Yeah, so I would sum those 3 up with, there's a lot that we disagree, a lot more that we actually disagree about than we agree on. And so the quicker we understand that, even within the church, that there's a lot we can disagree on. And let's not focus on what we disagree on. Let's have lively debates on what we disagree on. I encourage those. We need to have more of those. You know, we have this world where it's easy for people to get together and have conversations and have debates and have arguments over stuff. And unfortunately, within the church, it's not lending itself to these big, great debates, which we should have. You know, I see in the secular world that we do have debates where, you know, you have Sam Harris, who's arguably the biggest atheist in the world, or self-proclaimed, and you have Jordan Peterson, and they're having literally 3-day debates a couple years ago in Vancouver over what it means, over the existence of God. We should be having those within the church. John MacArthur should be standing up with your favorite guy,
Greg Boyd,
or and just having these debates and doing so with.
Well, they don't even want to be in a room together, so.
That's the thing. We need to get them in a room and have a debate, and because you know what, when you get in a room and you're like, this guy, I can tell this guy is a nice guy. He loves Jesus, and his gospel is. I'm not going to walk away and I'm not going to say that his gospel is my gospel. We're going to disagree, but we're still going to agree at the end of the day. We do love Jesus as our Lord and Savior. And so I think I'm fine with someone saying, I think he's leading people astray. And Greg Boyd saying, I think you're locking people out of the gospel, of the message of the gospel. That's fine. But we need to have those things where people can sit in a room, like at the Shepherds Conference, and Alistair Berg deigning to tell Granny to go to the grandson's trans thing, sit in a room, and you know what? You're going to sit in a room and be told that's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
2,000 men are going to sit in the room and be told, you know what? That's not the end of the day. Yes, I told her to love her grandchild, and you're upset with me about that. You think that's sending that grandchild to hell, or the grandma to hell, or me to hell? Tell me that to my face in a room.
Yeah.
And the more we have those conversations, I think that's less likely to happen. And so hopefully modern technology and all that will allow that stuff. Maybe the Grow to Whole podcast will one day become that kind of thing that happens. Not likely, but whatever. Okay, okay. And then finally, you're the church. So understand you're the church. If you're listening to this, you're the church. It doesn't matter where you're going, or even if you're not going to church. You are the church. Everywhere you go, you're the church. You're representing the Church of Jesus Christ. You're representing Jesus.
Yeah, and so there's some helpful phrases for you to use that Forrest recommended. He said, tell me your story. Again, it's not about you. It's about them. Our mission includes you. Again, it's about them. It's not about you. We are a diverse community. We are accepting. And then lastly, we feel tension too. Again, there's a struggle that's constantly going on. within Christianity that it's not something that's easily solved.
Yeah, and I think those are 4 phrases, and you might listen to that and say, "Well, I think those are phrases." No, I don't. I don't think those are phrases often enough employed at churches. I think a lot of churches, unfortunately, if I'm being I'm being judgmental, they don't want to hear your story. They want to hear how you've already been saved, or if they hear your story, it's because, oh, look at this magnificent thing that Jesus did and changed. We're all going to clap and feel great because Jesus changed this person, so they're now not an evildoer. That's not what telling me your story is. Going back to what I was talking about earlier, telling your story is, yeah, I grew up in a family where I got raped by 2 of my cousins, and this is where I'm at. It's led me on a long path of self-destructive behavior. We don't like to hear those things.
No.
Our mission includes you. Well, only if you're fully in on what only if you've been fully blessed by me. Diverse community, yeah, the church has always got a problem with that. And I don't mean like we're a white church and a Hispanic church, but yes, that includes. I think our church says it goes out of its way. I know our pastor does. I think there's a lot of. Our pastor says we want a diverse community.
We're a largely soccer mom church.
I think he means it, but it's also a self. The problem is self-selection, and the people who choose to go to our church are people who buy into that, largely speaking. So, and those who don't left. And then the last one is a hard one. We feel the tension too. Yes, I have read the Bible. And yes, there's a lot of things in there that I don't understand, and I find a lot of the things in the Old Testament completely contrary to what Jesus says, and I can't give you answers for them, and I'm, in fact, uncomfortable by them. And so, yes, I feel the same tension you have. And so, basically being a lot less certain about... I think, to sum it up, to be a Jesus-centered follower is to, as much as possible. Thanks, Tank and JoJo, who are fighting behind me. You're not being good Christian dogs at all. Look, dumb it down as easy as possible. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah,
that's it. And everything after that is a struggle and creates day-to-day tensions. I really want to love this person at work, but they're a pain in my ass. Or I really want to love this family member, this sister, who's a pain in my ass. How do I be a Jesus follower? Well, that might mean actually putting distance between you and them and not engaging with the sister is not a unchristian thing to do.
Yeah.
But it also sometimes means saying, I don't think I did anything wrong the last time we got together and got into an argument, but I'm going to apologize nonetheless, just hoping that an open arms are given to me instead of closed fists, and that this relationship can be given. And so we wrap it up again with being a Christian is a tension. It is not a how-to guide. If you want a how-to guide, then start reading Tony Robbins' books or Simon Sinek. Watch Simon Sinek videos on YouTube. There's no how-to guide in life with Jesus. It's a constant tension of how do I love God, meaning how do I try to remain pure, and what does that mean? In what context does purity for God be what is said in a book 2,000 years ago and is contextual and cultural? And how does that reflect with me today? I think that's the church's struggle today. And how do I love my neighbor? And what does that word love mean? Does it mean telling them, yeah, you know what? You're cheating on your wife. Probably shouldn't be cheating on your wife. Yes, that's probably a loving thing to do. But telling someone, I don't like you swearing in my presence because that's a sinful thing to do. That's probably not a loving thing to do. But These are the tensions we have to live day to day as a Jesus follower. It's not a how-to guide on living life.
Well, now you said that. Now people are going to come up to me and just be like, I don't like that you swear on the podcast.
Well, that's been a problem since the beginning. I would love to know the amount of people who stop listening because we drink beer and swear on it.
Oh, you say you swear. Yeah.
We swear.
You say we swear, but really it's like a 10-to-1 ratio. Like Tim says, like
It's still.
you're like, man, I could get behind that Tim dude, but that Colton guy is a little abrasive with those swear words every 5 seconds.
Wait, but I think okay. Well, if we wanted to do a swear jar, that's fine. We could do a swear jar and figure out this pretty quick.
Yeah, go fuck yourself.
Think it was. I think it was me though. Didn't I go heavy first, like in the first or second?
No,
episode?
it was me. You literally were like, you couldn't do it. I was like, bro, Tim, we agreed to this. We said we were gonna be different.
Colton's out. He's out on this limb. He's out on this iron bar out there as they're building the Empire State Building all alone by himself. I thought we were gonna swear together. You've left me out here on my own.
It's okay. I'll go down.
It's all right. That's all right. All right. We thank you for listening to this episode of the Go to Hell podcast. If you've already liked us or left a comment, thank you very much. If you haven't, you can go to hell.